and sticking with us through all this COVID-19.
That's
So,
right.
well, Dr. Williams, again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak
Oh,
with
of
us
course.
today. We're
Yep.
very excited to have you.
Thank you.
Dr. Williams has a PhD from Kentucky, is a professor of American history. Her areas of specialization include U.S. women's history and the history of sport. She's the author of and president of the Preservation and Future of Women in Baseball, which is dedicated to the, okay, this is my printout did not work right. Dr. Williams, can you just tell
Oh,
us?
of course, of course.
Oh,
I
oh, it's all jumbled.
oh,
I'm
that's
so sorry.
again another technology issue, right?
Yes. Yeah.
No, that's perfectly fine. I am a professor of women's history at Marshall, as most of you know, also a history of, or, I'm sorry, a professor of sport history. I'm the author of two books, one called the All-Americans After the AAG PBL. That is about the women that played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And my second book just came out May 1st, and that is about Isabel Lefty Alvarez. It's called The Improbable Life of a Cuban-American Baseball Star. And just a little a tidbit advice for folks. If you ever decide to publish a book, don't roll it out in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. It is not the time to do it, but we keep moving. So, and thank you. If you have other pieces of business you need to attend, that's fine. Otherwise, I can just launch in.
Okay, you're on. We're ready. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for being on. This is, I have to admit, one of the strangest ways that I have given this particular talk. And unfortunately, what you can't see is that my computer's standing on a ladder. So we make do during COVID, but thank you all so much for being on and for being interested in this story. As you know, 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution simply says, and I quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex," end quote, period. It's a simple statement to us today, only 28 words, not very objectionable, at least not to most of us, I wouldn't think. But believe me when I tell you, those were fighting words in 1848 when they were first uttered by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. But they didn't care. This was not their first fight, and they were certainly not afraid of another one. Many women who were, I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody. I can't quite tell who it is.
Eric, can you mute everyone except Dr. Williams?
Yeah. Okay, hopefully that's got it. These women who were the earliest feminists, the dedicated suffragists to that most of us know about, their fight for suffrage was not their first fight for social justice. And in fact, all of these women, every single one of them, had been staunch abolitionists. In fact, they learned about demanding equality. They learned techniques from the abolitionist movement. From as early as the very, very early days of the abolitionists or the anti-slavery movement, women were extremely important members of all the organizations. They were very dedicated to the fight. In fact, it's, I think, fair to say that the team of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who really are the ones who spearheaded that first women's rights convention, would not have even met had it not been for the abolitionist movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born Elizabeth Cady, and that's spelled C-A-D-Y, for those of you who don't know. Her father was an attorney. He too was a very dedicated abolitionist. And so she grew up with all of these abolitionists in and out of their house. She grew up with this idea of fairness and equality. And everyone should have the right to, well, equal rights. And so as she got older, she too became a staunch abolitionist. And in fact, she met a man named Henry Stanton, who was also a very dedicated abolitionist, and the two of them were married. Unlike today, of course, if you take a honeymoon or you take a trip, you may fly to Europe, you may do whatever, and you're only gone for a couple of weeks. Well, that was not the case in 1840. They got on a ship and they went to London to the International Slavery Convention. And again, that was in 1848. They were gone for quite some time. They were both very, very excited about this trip. It was not only their honeymoon, but it was also, they both so desperately believed in this cause of abolition. So they got to London. They on the first day of the convention, they walked to the front door, and Henry Stanton was welcomed and allowed to come in. Elizabeth, however, was told she had to sit in the balcony with the other women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not happy about that, but she went. She sat there fuming, complaining about the fact that women were not allowed on the main floor. Seated next to her was a woman named Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott was one of the best known abolitionists on the planet. Lucretia Mott was relegated to the upstairs. The two of them sat there for a couple of days and they talked and they got to know one another and they complained. And they both said, when we get back home, we need to do something about this. Now, it is important to note that seated just down the road from them was a very tall, elegant looking Black man named Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, of course, as most of you know, was a former slave and also a great orator and abolitionist. He was allowed to sit on the main floor of the anti-slavery convention, but refused because he said if women have to sit in the balcony, he would also sit in the balcony. That was 1840. It took a little time, of course, for them to get back home. Elizabeth and Henry lived in Boston and eventually moved to a small town in upstate New York called Seneca Falls. And Elizabeth was brilliant, by the way. She was an incredibly well-read woman. She was very smart. She was very articulate. And by the time she and Henry moved to Seneca Falls in the mid-1840s, she was bored. She had a lot of kids and she took care of her children, but she was bored. So she was very delighted one day when she got a message from a friend of hers who lived in a town very near Seneca Falls called Waterloo. Her friend said, Elizabeth, I have a dear friend in from out of state, and we're going to have tea, and I would love it if you would come to join us for tea. There will only be 5 or 6 of us. Elizabeth, of course, jumped on that chance, and she did indeed go to Waterloo to visit her friend. And when she walked in the door and she was introduced to her friend's acquaintance, she came face to face with Lucretia Mott again. So they sat over tea and basically created this revolution. They started talking. The other people there, the other women there kept saying, you know, this is interesting. This is a great idea. So they kept meeting. They kept meeting and they kept writing down grievances. And the grievances were things like married women should have the right to their own property. Women and girls should have the right to education. Again, these are not things that most of us would see as over the top, right? And certainly not by today's standards. So they continued to meet and they ultimately drafted what would become known as the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And it was called that in part because it was patterned after the Declaration of Independence. And the preamble to the Declaration, as most of you probably are aware, says something to the effect of all men are created equal. Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton changed that. And to include women. All men and women are created equal. But then she followed the same pattern that that the Declaration did. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, what you see is that it's a list of grievances. He did X. In other words, the king did this, or the king did not allow us to do that. So it's a list of grievances, but then it's also a list of resolutions. It's a list of, this is what he did or didn't do, and here's how we want it fixed. And that's exactly what Elizabeth and Lucretia did with the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And so the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments had things on it like married women should be allowed to own their own property. Girls should be allowed an education. Women, especially unmarried women, should be allowed an education. And then, I'm sorry, the employment. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, you know what? We have to add another one, voting. Women need to have the right to vote. Even Lucretia Mott disagreed with that. Even Lucretia Mott said, oh no, they're going to think we're ridiculous if you do that. Now let's not get too crazy with that. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton continued, and she demanded that the right to suffrage be included in the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, and it was. Now, in the 19th century, every social movement, and there were a lot of them, every social movement basically amounted to, there was sort of a set of standards. You created an organization, you had a convention, you know, there was a pattern, a way you did this. And they did exactly the same thing. What they decided once they had written the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, that they needed to have a convention. So they decided to have it at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. And they put in the tiniest little 1-inch ad in the Seneca Falls newspaper. It simply said, Women's Rights Convention, July 19 and 20, 1848, Wesleyan Chapel, Seneca Falls. That was it. It was just this tiny little 1-inch ad. They had no idea if anyone was going to see it. They had no idea what to expect. And as the time got closer, you have to understand, Elizabeth and Lucretia Mott and the other women, they were risking arrest by speaking in public. So it was just the act of being there was rebellion. So again, as they got closer to the day, they were nervous, and they had no idea, would anyone come, would the police be there? They just didn't know. Well, they also then had no way of knowing exactly how many people would have seen that little ad. The ad got its way around, and it certainly caught the attention of a 19-year-old glove worker named Charlotte Woodward. Charlotte Woodward, as I said, was 19. She was from fairly near Syracuse, New York. She saw that little ad. And on the morning of July 19th, long before sunup, she hitched the horses to the wagon and took off by herself. It was about 40 miles from where she lived to Seneca Falls. She spent most of the trip, no other people around, nothing. And as she started to get to what would be today a crossroads, not so much an intersection, but a crossroads, as she approached the town of Seneca Falls and approached this crossroads, she started to hear things. She started to hear sounds, and she couldn't tell if it was people, if it was wagons, or whatever it was. But she couldn't see because of all the trees. So as she approached she got a little closer to this crossroads, and the noise got a little louder. She realized when she approached that crossroads that as far as she could see to the right and as far as she could see to the left was a line of carriages, buggies, people on horseback, and she fell in line behind them. And when they got to the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, there was a line of people out the door to get in. ultimately, they found that it was just over 300 people showed up in Wesleyan Chapel. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Seneca Falls, and if you haven't, I hope you go. Um, it is, for someone like me who's a history professor, also a diehard feminist, and someone who believes that the history of women is in this country is this country's history. Standing there in Seneca Falls, in the ruins, basically, or the remains of what was Wesleyan Chapel, is about as special as it gets. But if you get the chance to go, you should. So you know, on that morning, Elizabeth and Lucretia, both, by the way, their husbands, they both had husbands named Henry. They kind of backed out of opening the ceremony a little bit because they felt like this was something that might actually cause some legal problems, or might cause, you know, people some uproar. So Lucretia Mott's husband, Henry, opened the convention. It was standing room only. One of the things that happened was that people sat in this, and I don't know if you've been in upstate New York in July or in the middle of summer. It is not pleasant. It is hot. It is steamy. It is, and of course, we're not talking about a spot with air conditioning. So this tiny chapel was crammed with 300 people. And so they sat there and they listened to the openings, and they listened to Henry Mott explain who these women were. And then he turned it over to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and many of you have seen pictures of her. She was a rather large, rotund woman, but she demanded a presence, right? She walked to the podium and just simply started reading what was the preamble to the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And back then, students, and actually in the lives of some of you maybe, students were required to memorize the preamble. And they were required, you know, kids were required to memorize the preamble or other things. So everyone in that room knew how it started. All men are created equal. So when Elizabeth Cady Stanton walked up to that podium, and she pulled herself up to her full, like 4'10" or whatever, and said, "All men and women are created equal," there was this, what, because again, everybody knew what to expect. This was not, it's like, wait a minute, you don't change those words. Elizabeth continued, and she read, "Women have not been allowed jobs. Married women are not allowed to maintain or keep their own property. Women and girls are not educated." And she kept reading the list, and people got more and more into it. And yes, that's right. And then she got down toward the bottom and she said, "And women have not been given the right to vote." And it was this, what? Wait a minute. And so then she went on to read the resolutions. "We demand this, we demand this." And then she got to the 9th one and she said, "We demand female suffrage," and the place erupted. And there was, oh, no, wait a minute. Now, the rest of this we can get, right? We understand that, not this. No. So basically what happened was that for 2 days, people sat in that hot, steamy chapel, and they talked about these things. They listened and they debated, and pretty much everyone was in agreement with all of them except suffrage. And it was that debate that became so heated, literally and figuratively. And at one point, it seemed as though that was not going to pass. And Stanton was not having any of it. So she kept pushing. And finally, in the back corner, a tall, thin black man stood up, waved his hand, and when they called on him, everyone turned around to look into the face of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was at that meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, and he stood up to say, if women want equality, if women want to have education and employment, and if they want to be treated equally, they have to have a voice. The only way you have a voice is to vote. And if you want all these other things, then you have to have a say in in who becomes a legislator. So it was that, and believe me, I am nowhere near as eloquent as Frederick Douglass, and I did not do it justice, but it was him speaking up on behalf of women, saying, you know, you've got to do this. Ultimately, they did. 100 people, 68 men and 68 women and 32 men ultimately signed their names to the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And one of those women was that glove worker, Charlotte Woodward. They signed their name to that document that was basically was a revolutionary document. In fact, later when he was asked about it, Frederick Douglass said of the document, of the Declaration, and I quote here, "The document was the grand movement for attaining the civil, social, political, and religious rights of women." This was a document of rebellion, and it started over tea. And there's something so beautiful about that to me, that these women foment rebellion over tea. Now, they bring people together and they read the Declaration, and again, 100 people sign it, and this movement then begins. But it did not take those women long to understand the beginning was the easy part. This movement, which we can pinpoint July 20, 1848. This movement may have started on that day, but it took 72 years for women to finally get the right to vote. The movement took a lot of turns and a lot of paths. And as I said earlier, when you embark on a social movement in the 19th century in the United States, one of the first things you do is create an organization. And that's exactly what they did. They created the National Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was its first president. And basically what they did was, and it was really brilliant. I mean, what they did was start planning for women in other states, and mostly in the New England area at first. Remember, you know, communication was not that easy. Travel was certainly not that easy. And women by themselves traveling was not easy. But what they did was it's like they planted these little seeds in different cities and different towns, and then chapters of the National Women's Suffrage Association sprang up. Well, most people, if they know any suffragist at all, they know Susan B. Anthony. Well, Susan B. Anthony was not in Seneca Falls for this first convention, but it was in the early 1850s. It was only a few years later that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was walking down the street in Seneca Falls, and she ran into a woman who she was introduced to, who was a Quaker and a diehard abolitionist, and that woman was Susan B. Anthony. They had a lot in common. They had their desire for equality and their desire for abolition. They had all of that in common, and they became friends. Eventually, Elizabeth convinced Susan B. Anthony that you know, yes, abolition is important, but let's shift our focus. Let's shift our focus to women and the rights of women. And eventually then, and actually very shortly after the convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony became the most formidable team you can imagine. Elizabeth continued to have children. I don't really remember how many she had, but it was a lot. She was also not in the best health. So what happened was Elizabeth would write the speeches, and Susan, get on the train. She was unmarried. She would get on a train and go to places and deliver them. They were lightning and thunder, basically. Susan B. Anthony became the face of the suffrage movement in the 19th century, particularly because of that, because she was the one out there. She was the one delivering those messages. She and Elizabeth were lifelong friends. And as I said, Elizabeth was the first president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Susan was a very active member in the organization. Both were very well respected. You can imagine, we're talking 1850s here. As you know, we're starting to inch ever closer to the Civil War at this point. And so both of these women, all suffragists, and you know, I need to stop here and say, I'm doing something that in my classroom, I always tell my students I don't want to do. I'm talking about this history by talking to you about the big names. I'm talking to you about the suffrage movement, but I'm focused on Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott, and then people, you probably know their names. My method of teaching is anything but that. Yeah, you got to talk about those people, but it's also important to understand the suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, the women's movement, the peace movement, the civil rights movement, pick a movement. But none of them happen, and none of them are successful only because of the people who you know their names. They are successful because of the millions of people you don't know. And that is true certainly of the suffrage movement. So I want to say that because I'm really focused on them, because that really gives us an in into this. But it's important to understand that thousands upon thousands of people were involved in this movement. So as we approach the Civil War, their efforts don't stop. Certainly, these women continue to be abolitionists, all of them. They continue to believe that slavery is a moral, ethical, just travesty. But their focus is primarily suffrage. Once the Civil War is over, the 13th Amendment was ratified. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment set up the definition of citizenship. The 15th Amendment caused a lot of trouble. The 15th Amendment is universal male suffrage. It was the debate over the 15th Amendment that absolutely split the suffrage movement in half. After the Civil War, and there was a push, everyone, again, no one was debating whether or not slavery should end or that there should be a citizenship requirement that includes everyone. But universal male suffrage was problematic for these women. What they said was, look, this is great. Yes, Black men should have the right to vote, but why are you stopping here? Black women suffered slavery. Now's the time. And when you think back on it, it really was the time, right? This would have been so easy, just universal suffrage. But there was no way they were going to allow that to happen because it was, quote, hard enough to ratify the 13th and the 14th Amendments. So the suffragists in the movement were split. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony continued to be very focused on women's suffrage. And many women said, this is the, quote, Negro's hour. We have got to support universal male suffrage so that Black men will have an opportunity to vote. And when they do have that opportunity, then when it's our turn, they'll step up and they'll help us. That branch of the suffrage movement is really most kind of marked by a woman named Lucy Stone. Lucy Stone is the one who said, this is the Negro's hour. We have got to work earnestly to get Black men the right to vote. she created a separate organization called the American Women's Suffrage Association. And the two organizations split. And it did a great deal of damage to the suffrage movement. It did a great deal of damage to a lot of relationships. And I have to admit, I have always been in awe of the things that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were able to do, and I admired that. But when, as an undergraduate history student, I read some of the very incredibly racist things they said in this debate, it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. But as a professional historian, it's a little easier to kind of step back and put it into a perspective. Because some of the things that they said were things like, well, you're going to give the right to vote to these illiterate, uneducated Black men, and white women are educated, and you're not going to let us vote. So they used what was incredibly racist arguments. And so again, I am not excusing them by any means, but when you put them into the context of that time, you do understand why they use those arguments, but I certainly don't agree with those arguments. The 15th Amendment was indeed ratified, and just, the history professor in me is coming out now, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments collectively are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And so once the 15th Amendment was ratified, the country's like, okay, we're done now. Well, women still don't have the right to vote. And so as we move then into the 1880s and the 1890s, again, we still have a split movement. We still, even after the 15th Amendment was ratified, people did not forgive. And so it was difficult, and the movement sort of waxed and waned a little bit. But it was in 1890 that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone and a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt decided, with the urging, by the way, of some younger feminists, those old tactics aren't going to work anymore, and we need to come back together. And it was in 1890 that they did. And they created the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. And again, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first president. Carrie Chapman Catt ultimately became the sort of leader of that piece of the movement, that organization, but also that those tactics. Carrie Chapman Catt was new President Woodrow Wilson, and he ultimately became president. And they understood, or she understood, that in that moment, the way to work this, the way to move this forward, was to work within the system. In other words, don't upset the apple cart, right? So Carrie Chapman Catt and this sort of upper class white, primarily white organization believed that they talked to the president and they asked for this and they asked for that. And of course, that worked for a little while. As you know, Woodrow Wilson did become president. Wilson was indeed president as we approached World War I. We see, by the way, we talk about how history repeats itself. We're seeing that today in a lot of movements, but a younger generation of feminists in the early years of the 20th century had spent some time in England. They had an earlier suffrage movement, and a lot of these young women spent some time there and they learned some techniques. They learned some strategies that they brought back to the US with them. By the time we're approaching World War I, and and again, I'll also say that we have this image of women, quote, helping the war effort during World War II as Wax and Rosie the Riveter working in the factories and doing all these things, and we tend to not think about what women did or didn't.
Okay.
What women did or didn't do during World War I, but women were very active in helping that helping the country during that time as well. But one of the things these young women that were suffragists who spent some time in England, spent some time in that suffrage movement, came back, and they said to Carrie Chapman Catt, "We've got to be more bold. We've got to stand up. We've got to do something. We can no longer just stand back." And Catt said, it's wartime, or well, it wasn't exactly wartime, but it was pretty clear that that's what was going to happen, or something was going to happen. And she resisted it. And they kept pushing and they kept pushing. And two of those women, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, said, "Oh no, we're going to keep pushing." By the way, let me just, and again, kind of truth and advertisement here. I think Alice Paul is about the closest thing to a hero I will ever have. And I will also say to you, if you have not seen the movie Iron Jawed Angels, as soon as we're done here, don't do it now because I'm not finished, but as soon as we're done here, go find it. It is stunning. And at the end, if you don't jump up off your couch and run out to vote, even if it's not election day, then you're really not paying attention. But Alice Paul and Lucy Burns came back to DC, and they said they were young women. They were energetic and articulate. And they said to Carrie Chapman Catt, "No, we got to be more in your face. Let's protest in front of the White House." Oh, no, we don't want to do that. We never protest in front of the White House. And we sure don't do it in a difficult time like this. Well, I won't go into all the ways that they fought that. But ultimately what happened is that Alice Paul and Lucy Burns did indeed lead a younger group of suffragists, of feminists to protest. They became known as the Silent Sentinels. They would stand in front of the White House gate just stand there. They didn't speak. They didn't scream and yell. They just held signs that say, "Women demand the vote." You didn't picket the White House during a war. And at this point, we have moved into World War I. You just didn't do that. It was unpatriotic. And how dare you women ask for something now? But they continued. They continued to picket. They continued to demand their right to vote. On November 15th, 1917, those women, many of them, there were 30-some women in all, standing in front of the White House, were arrested. They were arrested for, quote, obstructing the sidewalk. They were taken to a workhouse, a prison for women. And the prison guards were told by, can we mute Freddie's iPad?
Okay.
Right and far enough back.
I will. I will.
I don't know.
I rain later.
Okay.
I'm not sure who Freddie is, but his iPad needs to be muted. November 1917, November 15th, 1917, 30-some women were arrested, and as I said, they were taken to a prison for women. The warden told the guards, "Teach those women a lesson," and they did. They beat Lucy Burns. They chained her arms above her head on the cell bars above her head with her feet just barely off the ground, and she hung there. They left her hanging there overnight. She was bleeding and gasping for air. They threw another one of the women named Dora Lewis into a dark cell and smashed her head against the iron bed. It knocked her out, and her cellmate thought she was dead. Additional affidavits said that the guards grabbed, drug, beat, choked, slammed, pinched, twisted, and kicked the women in what would become known as a night of terror. The women were treated horribly. How dare they protest anything this country's doing, and especially during war? For weeks, the women's only water came from an open pail, and their food, all of it colorless slop, was infested with worms. And when Alice Paul embarked on a hunger strike, they strapped her into what looked.
Yes.
Okay,
They-
do I need to sign?
No, no, can you show me?
Oh, yeah.
Can we take care of Freddie?
Ryan, can you mute everyone, please?
New one there and the other one out on the porch, please.
I don't think it's muted still, but we'll keep going. Up, there we go. Excellent. So when Lucy, I'm sorry, when Alice Paul went on a hunger strike, they literally drug her and strapped her into a chair that looked like an old electric chair. In other words, the chairs that they would electrocute prisoners in. They strapped her down. They took the straps and they strapped her arms down. They strapped her legs. They strapped her head against the back, and they used a funnel to pour liquid into her throat. They force-fed her like that for literally for weeks, until eventually someone snuck out, one of the women snuck a note out to her husband to let them know what was going on. Embarrassed and angry, President Woodrow Wilson finally acknowledged, maybe those women had a point after all. He finally supported the 19th Amendment. And in August 1920, 72 years after that Seneca Falls Convention, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. 72 years. And believe me, it was close. So Congress passes it, but then you have X number of months, years to ratify it. We were down to the last one. We needed one more. We were down to the very, very end. And unfortunately, the last state was Tennessee. Tennessee was then and is now a conservative state. A lot of the suffragists had gone down there to lobby the state legislature. But it looked as though maybe it wasn't going to go. So in the morning of the vote, they come in, the men, and of course they were all men, they either wore a red rose or a white rose, which would indicate how they felt about suffrage. A young man who was a first-year legislator whose name was Harry Burns showed up that day, proudly showing off his vote, which was an anti-suffrage vote. He sat down at his desk, though, beforehand, and he stuck his hands in his pocket of his jacket, and he pulled out a letter. Oh, yeah, his secretary had handed him this letter that he had recently gotten from his mother. He opened it up, and it said, "Dear son, I've been paying attention to some of these shenanigans going on in the State House about suffrage. I am sure you will be a good boy and do what's right, that you will vote for suffrage. He took off his flower, and he did indeed vote for suffrage, yeah, because after all, his mother told him to. And we did indeed ratify the 19th Amendment. There was only one woman in attendance at the Seneca Falls Convention that lived long enough to see that ratification, and that was Charlotte Woodward. At the age of 90, she was too ill to vote, but in 1920, but she proudly claimed her place among the thousands of suffragists when she was interviewed, and this is her quote: "I was not alone. I do not believe there was any community anywhere in which the souls of women were not beating their wings in rebellion." Those women, those suffragists, waged a battle so that I could walk into the polling booth and cast my ballot. In all my classes, and especially the women's history classes, and yes, even in the sport history classes, I talk a lot about voting. I talk about its importance and its necessity for everyone, especially women. But I always, even the last time we were in the classroom, I always have a huge number of students who have either never registered to vote or who just don't get out to vote on election day. And they always ask me things, and you all hear this. Everybody asks the same questions. Why should I vote? What difference does it make? My vote doesn't count. It doesn't really matter to me. Those guys are all crooked anyway. You know, all the excuses. It's raining. I don't have a babysitter, whatever it is. And it is absolutely maddening to me, that we're still in some ways fighting this same battle. So I turn it around on them. Why should we vote? Well, why? Because we are 51% of the population. And with that majority, we can and we should influence the direction of critical policies important to all of us. In one poll, and it's been a few years ago now, and the poll was taken with like 4,000 women, and they were from diverse backgrounds. The poll found that 65% of women polled believe that this country is not spending its money in the right way. They believe that retirement security, job opportunities, good schools, and housing costs are all of a higher importance than the military budget. Yet, women do not effectively bring about that kind of change because we don't vote. 22 million unmarried women did not vote in the last election. 22 million. And more than 50 million eligible women, married and unmarried, are not even registered to vote. So why should we vote? Well, if unequal pay, healthcare, education, terrorism, and war aren't enough reasons, do it because it was a right that women earned. Do it because it was earned. Women fought and died for that right. We owe it to ourselves and we owe it to them. We owe it to future generations. I don't care how you vote. I don't care what your politics are. I could not possibly care less. And I tell my students the same thing. Never allow a decision to be made in your name without your consent. And if you don't go vote, that's exactly what's happening. Never, ever let an election go by without exercising your right to vote. Always speak up. Always speak your mind. Foment rebellion. And if you have to, have a tea party. Whatever it takes, speak up. Tell people the importance of voting. Those who came before us, those who were force-fed, those who were beaten, those who were jailed, all of them, they did that so that you and I and all of us can have a right to vote. The history of women's suffrage is, and what I've given you here is a little nutshell version. I teach an entire class on it. But it is absolutely crucial, not just in 2020 when we're celebrating the 100th anniversary, but it is always important It is always important to vote and to speak your mind. And we earned that vote. We earned that right. And absolutely, it is our right, it is our responsibility, and hopefully, most people will think of it as a privilege. I thank you for listening, and I am more than happy to answer questions.
At this time, we can all unmute, and so we can ask questions of Dr. Williams.
Well, I just want to thank you for a really great presentation. The information, we always know bits and pieces, but it's wonderful to have it all put together, especially as we.
I think we lost you there.
I think we did.
Yeah.
When is your class being offered? I have a master's in history, and I'm sitting there thinking, I want to take your class.
Well, I actually, in the spring semester, I taught, it was a one-time only, it was called 100 Years of Suffrage.
I remember that.
And I was devastated. I mean, you know, because of course it was cut short. And I mean, I taught it, I finished it online.
Yeah.
But I'm like, seriously, I'm not going to be around for the 200th anniversary, you know, so what are the odds? But in my women's history class, I teach it's called, it's History 250, Women in U.S. History. I teach every fall. And this year I'm teaching Women's Studies 101, which will be focused on suffrage. And so in all of my history classes, you know, I spend a lot of time talking about it, but particularly those two.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Dr. Williams?
Yeah, this is Rick. Do you find that many of your students think that your course is just for women to take, or do you have a lot of, it's the men we need to educate? Do we get a lot of men taking that class? Thank you.
Oh, sure. Thank you for the question, Rick. It's actually a really good question. And I am kind of, I have this sort of weird following of students. I am a history professor by training, first and foremost, American women's history, but I am also a historian of sport. So I teach sport history classes. My sport history classes get a lot of men. Now I also get women in there, but it gets a lot of men. My women's history and women's studies classes get a lot of women. But what has happened over the years is that I've developed sort of a following. And so I walk into a women's history class and I may have 4 or 5 guys sitting in the back that were in my football and American culture class. And they took it, they taken the class because they know me, they like me, and they get something despite themselves. So the short answer to that is, yeah, mostly it is girls and women, but I do get some guys in there, and you're right. I mean, it's all of us that needs that education. But the one thing I start, especially my women's history class, I start on the first day by saying, look, this is not a class that's about bashing men. You know, we're not about bashing men. I don't want one single right to be taken away from any human being in this country. And I don't care what your gender is. And so it's not about that. It's about understanding that there has been for decades and decades and decades this, quote, master narrative of history where women and a lot of other people have been left out, and that's just not okay anymore.
Diane, you're back on if you'd like to finish your statement. We've lost you for a minute.
Oh, I thought I had finished, but I just appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
While I'm on, let me just ask a question about, do we know the percentage of women that vote in, say, our national elections, like say 2016, compared to the percentage of men that vote?
You know, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I'm sure we know those numbers. I mean, you know, we have statistics on everything, but I really don't know. And that's a good question. I should find out because it would be interesting. And what will be interesting to see, because of course we had a woman running for president the last time, you know, you would think that that would elevate the number of women who voted. I mean, you know, either way, but I just don't know those statistics.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
This is Jane McKee. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
I'm having trouble with my camera today. I think it's my computer itself, but I just want to say I have been to Seneca Falls, but I was there 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I guess. I probably was about in my 20s.
Yeah.
And oh my goodness, I wish I'd had the knowledge you just gave us when I was there. It
Well,
was, you know,
yeah.
it would have made such a difference. But I think it's really important. They talk about the men, but I think the women too need this knowledge of who went before us and whose shoulders
Right.
we stand on
That's
today. I'm with Elizabeth. I'll take your class too.
Well, thank you.
so much.
And both of you are always welcome. And what I would say to you is go back to Seneca Falls, right? I mean,
Yes.
you know, enjoy it. I think the very essence for me of the importance of history is exactly what you just articulated, Jane. It's, you know, we have to know we have a history. I am a firm believer in the saying, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And it's one of the things that makes my work that I do with the International Women's Baseball Center so important. What I believe is that girls and women today, they have to know they stand on the shoulders of greatness. You know, I didn't make this stuff up. I stand on the shoulders, and all of us are going to be the shoulders next, right? I mean, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns stood on the shoulders of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and on and on and on. And by the way, I will say, Alice Paul, as soon as the amendment was ratified, Alice Paul created the National Women's Party. And she introduced in 1923, for the first time, the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Right, we still, by the way, do not have an Equal Rights Amendment. Alice Paul is the one who is responsible for writing it and for first introducing it in Congress. And it has been introduced every session of Congress since 1923. And so you're right. We need to know those things. You don't have to agree with it. I don't care about that. I don't care what your politics are, but what you have to know is that you're not the first. I'm not the first. I'm not, you know, I'm not even the 100th. But there were others. And so for young girls particularly, they need to understand they have a history.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Betty Barrett.
Hi, Betty.
Another thing that the virus problem has gotten in the way of is the celebration of the anniversary. And there is going to be a parade, car parade, on August 26th.
Yes.
From St. Mary's Health, whatever that's new place is called, downtown.
Yep.
Starting at 3:30, the League of Women Voters,
right,
members or sympathizers and thank you donors, are working on that with Marshall and don't know who else. I know you know about it.
Yeah.
It would be very nice to have a big crowd of women driving downtown in decorated cars.
Yeah.
Calling attention to this.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, with this group, you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's often what happens. Yeah.
But we need to show our presence and preach some more.
Right.
Also, there is a wonderful series that Kent Burns did on women's suffrage. It's like everything, very detailed and very long.
Mm-hmm.
Well worth seeing in the library. Downtown Library has the videos, discs,
yes,
which works very well. But There's a lot going on, unfortunately. It's gotten lost.
I know. I thought to myself, really? Really? It's like COVID and my, again, switching from my women's history hat to my baseball hat. This is also the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues in baseball. And so it's like, what are the odds that these really amazing anniversaries that should be bringing people out of the woodwork for celebration are having to be done like this? But at the same time, it's okay. At least we're doing it, right?
Mrs. Barrett, can you tell, when you know more, or Dr. Williams, about this parade, can you send it to me so I can send it out to the group?
Yeah, I can send you some things.
Yes, please.
Sure.
Good.
Thank you.
Glad to do that.
And,
Yeah.
Tell us again, who has a series on women's suffrage? Is it the public library or Marshall's library?
Public library.
Pardon me?
The public library, Campbell County Public Library.
And
Yeah.
could you include a little bit of information about that in your email? So again, to me, so I can share that with everyone.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, this is Rick again with 2 quick points. Number one, I think, Kat, every person who's going to become a teacher should enroll in one of your classes to learn how to give a talk.
Thank
And the
you.
second point is that since I'm speaking next month, I'm now going to be upset at Elizabeth for putting you in front of me.
Well, I have no doubt that you're just being nice, but thank you very much. I appreciate that. And, part of it is, Rick, and I guess anyone that speaks on any subject, if you have a passion for it, I think that's the key, right? I mean, I am the luckiest woman in the world. I get to talk about this stuff, and I get to read about this stuff, and I get to do these kinds of talks, and every now and then I get to see a student come back and say, wow, I never forgot that story about that guy, in Tennessee, and he took off that flower, and and so every now and then we get that, but I sure appreciate it, Rick.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Williams? Comments? Well, I thoroughly enjoyed I'm not wrapping up by any stretch, but when I started my master's program in history, I had mostly male professors with the exception of Dr. Frances Hensley. Yep. And I was so pleased that every professor I had, especially one in particular, encouraged me to write from a woman's point of view, to study.
Oh, that's great.
It was just so uplifting to me.
Yeah,
and so I wrote my thesis on the Junior League, both locally and nationally. Mm-hmm. And I studied the origins locally and nationally, and the Depression and World War II years.
Right.
And I was encouraged to do so. And I was always encouraged to write about women or a woman's point of view. And I found that so refreshing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's great. That's great. Where did you get your degree?
At Marshall.
At Marshall. Did you have one of our most renowned and fabulous professors, Dr. Woodard, by any chance, who's joining us today?
I did take Dr. Woodard's class on Russia, and it was Dr. Robert Maddox that I had.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because I studied mostly American history from 1850 to 1950, mostly.
Yeah, right,
and
right.
Dr. Maddox always encouraged me to look at it from a woman's point of view, or to study a woman relating to what we were dealing with. Of course, Dr. Frances Hensley, she's not on right now, but she taught Southern women's history.
Right.
That was a wonderful class too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have such a strong history department at Marshall, but I was so impressed that I was encouraged always to write from a woman's point of view.
That's great. And the way we do history now is very different from the way it was 10 years ago, or when I got my PhD, and certainly from 40 years ago and 50 years ago. It continues to evolve. And so it's just, it's our department has done that. It has always done that. And we are very fortunate. In fact, I'm going to brag a little bit. The history department at Marshall is, I believe I'm correct in saying, the most sort of decorated or celebrated department in COLA. And we have teaching awards, you know, it goes on and on. And we're a group of really dedicated folks.
You are, and getting back to Dr. Woodard, he is a fascinating lecturer.
Yeah.
He keeps your attention. He knows his subject matter. Dr. Maddox was another favorite. Dr. Sari. A lot of American history courses. So Marshall's always had a very strong history department. And that's probably also what led me ultimately to, because my undergraduate is in marketing and business administration. I'm very a
little different.
Yeah. But no, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions or comments?
Well, you should mention that Dr. Wood gave some talks on World War I to the group the very first year that we were in existence, and they were really great. And we might want to think, but
I was going to say maybe we can get Dr. Woodard to speak with us again.
Sorry about putting you on the spot there. Tag, you're it.
Well, we'll tap into that again. Well, when I took this program over, Dr. Pittenger, when we talked about, you know, our thoughts and ideas and goals, he wanted me to tap into all the, not just the resources, but to look at the resources at Marshall first, because we have a lot of rich history and resources at Marshall with the faculty and staff. And so, we're blessed. We're very blessed. And
we are, you know, you tell people you teach at Marshall, like if I'm traveling, I'm around someplace around the country or whatever. And mostly what they know is the movie We Are Marshall, or they know football in general. But if you start talking to people that are, like if I'm at an academic conference, or if I'm, you know, in that world, they know Marshall. And they know the reputation Marshall has, and so I'm very lucky to be part of this department and certainly part of Marshall.
Well, you have big shoes to follow with the ones that have taken their.
I know, believe me, I know, and I continue to work toward that.
Oh, I think you're doing more than a great job, and we're blessed to have this. Marshall's phenomenal. I just think it's the jewel, one of the jewels of West Virginia. We've got a lot of good colleges and universities.
Right.
Certainly, we're one of the shining stars of West Virginia.
Right.
I'm proud of that. I'm proud to have gone to Marshall.
We don't talk about that one up north, though, right?
No, that's almost in Pittsburgh, right? So, do we have any other comments or questions for Dr. Williams? Any thoughts about anything?
Just a quick question. It's Charlie Bowen. Just a quick question.
Charlie.
How you doing, Kat?
I'm all right. How are you?
Well, hunkering down.
All right.
I'm curious, have you given any more thought to the 1920s class that got put on hold? I'm getting increasingly fascinated by the 1920s because the cartoon history of America says it was just the roaring 20s and a good time. But the more you learn about it, the more fascinating it becomes. And I think you would be excellent for teaching that.
Well, thank you. And for the rest of you, what Charlie's talking about, before, you know, again, a worldwide pandemic, one of the things that I had thought about doing was teaching a special topics class that was just about the 1920s. And because, I mean, Charlie's right. You know, you can look at it like, oh, the Jazz Age, the Harlem Renaissance, and all, you know, all the blues and all this stuff, and that's true. But wow, what a decade. And so COVID really kind of blew all that out of the water. But Charlie, I am thinking about teaching that. I really want to wait until I know that we're going to be, and I don't know that we're ever going to go back to quote normal, but that we're going to be back on campus, because I teach better, as some of you on here know. I am better when we have that interaction, and I think this is a class that will not just be a lecture class. It'll be a lecture and discussion, and so I am going to teach it. I just don't know when, because I really, you know, unfortunately, we just have to wait and see what happens with all this. But thank you for asking.
Well, we'll definitely be in there when you do it. That could be great.
Thank you. Thank you,
Well,
Charlie.
and on that note, I want to remind everyone, if you're 65 or older, you may audit a class at
That's right.
I think it's $50, I think. It's a very nominal fee for the information.
$40 a class.
Is it 40 a class,
Mhm.
Mr. Rowe?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I just
Yeah.
want to kind of remind everyone of that because it's,
Yep. And you know what? I love it. I love it when, I don't care your age. I don't care if you want to audit a class. I really, really enjoy it. And some of the best students I've had in my classes are folks who come in because they want to be there, right? And they get a lot out of it, but then we, meaning me and the other students, get a lot out of what they have to offer. So, and you are always welcome in one of my classes, always.
good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, when you're talking about auditing and older students over 65, since I clearly am in that ballpark, one of the things I think about is the voting. The amendment changed the voting, but it really changed so much more. And if you're old enough, you can remember the times when there were things that were absolutely off limits to women.
That's right.
Even in the 50s and 60s. You
Right.
just couldn't do that. You couldn't join it. I mean, even locally, the Rotary,
Yeah.
years ago in the 80s,
Yeah.
my business partner and I decided we thought it might be nice to join the Rotary.
Uh-huh.
And we were told we would be very good candidates when they wanted women. By the time they
Ooh.
wanted women, we
Yeah.
were too busy in our practice to really
Right.
take an hour off every.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
forget that had to be in the late 80s since we didn't start our practice till 85.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm 62 and I graduated from high school pre-Title IX. I mean, I was a former athlete, but I had no place to play. I mean, there were no sports for girls. I mean, I played out on the street or whatever, but so it's not just the vote, but
Right.
it is that, and Frederick Douglass was absolutely right. If you want all that other stuff to change, then you need to have a voice, because ultimately the reason other pieces of legislation came along was because women had the right to vote, and they could say, wait a minute, you don't support women getting an education? Oh yeah, you're not getting my vote. So he was right. He was right on target. And so you're right to bring that up. And I really think that there's, and this is what I talk about in my women's history classes too, is that, this is just a stepping stone, right? This was not the end all be all to anything. And that's why it was so important to Alice Paul that just a year or two after the ratification, she started the National Women's Party and created the Equal Rights Amendment. Like, she understood that, right? She understood that in the moment, not hindsight of 100 years. Right?
Yep.
I think we've come a long way in the last 100 years. And but like Diane just mentioned, I didn't realize even that Rotary was a gentleman-only organization until more recent times.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, most people just don't know those histories, right? It's just, it was kind of like, that's just the way it was.
Right.
You just didn't upset the apple cart. I mean,
Right.
and that's, we may not always like it, and we may not always feel comfortable with it when it happens, but picking up that apple cart and throwing it across the street, that's the way you make change.
Yep, absolutely. Do we have any other comments or questions or concerns or anything we want to add to this wonderful discussion we've had today? Well, Dr. Williams, again, I thank you for taking time out of your schedule. I know COVID's just made everything different and crazy.
It's weird, isn't it? It's just weird.
But I'm impressed at how Marshall just on a dime flipped everything to online, how the administration has just rolled with so much.
Mm-hmm.
And we keep rolling along, hoping for the cure, the vaccine, medication, play itself out. Whichever comes first, I hope it's soon.
I do too. I do too, because really, as much as this has been hard for all of us and not traveling and all of that, when I found out yesterday that it is entirely possible there will not be college football, I knew I had had enough.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the last straw for me. So let's hope they get this taken care of so we don't have to miss it.
Sooner than soon.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This has been wonderful. I so appreciate the invitation and the conversation. Please feel free. You're welcome to share my email address with this group. And if anyone would like to reach out, if you have questions or if you just want to chat about stuff, I'm more than willing to do that.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you again. Thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.